Pick any country, go to its capital city, find its seat of government. You will see the same dome, the same proportions, the same Roman columns below it. Whether you are in Washington, Budapest, Havana, Bucharest, or Colombo, the silhouette is identical. Now try to find who designed them. The official records either go silent, contradict themselves, or point to men who were dead before the buildings broke ground. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Let's start with the most famous one, the United States Capitol. Most history textbooks credit William Thornton as the original architect, then Benjamin Henry Latrobe, then Charles Bulfinch, and finally Thomas U. Walter, who added the famous cast iron dome in the 1850s and 1860s. 4 architects across roughly 70 years. No unified vision, no single master plan on record. And yet, the building that emerged looks like it was drawn by one hand in one afternoon. That cast iron dome, specifically, is where things start to get strange. Construction began in 1855. The dome you see today was completed in 1863. In the middle of a civil war, with the Union fractured, money hemorrhaging from military expenditures, thousands dying every week, President Lincoln made the decision to keep construction going. His official reasoning was that a completed Capitol dome would send a message of national confidence to the world. Historians have accepted this explanation for 160 years, but look at the dome itself. Cast iron construction at that scale, in that era, required engineering knowledge that was, by most accounts, not yet formalized in American institutions. The dome weighs approximately 8.9 million pounds. It sits on a drum that sits on the original sandstone structure. The thermal expansion calculations alone, the way the iron panels were designed to contract in winter and expand in summer without cracking the structure beneath, represent a level of precision that engineers in the 1850s were not formally trained to produce. Thomas U. Walter is credited with the dome's design. Walter was a capable architect. He had built institutions in Philadelphia. But when researchers have gone looking for his original dome calculations, the detailed engineering documents, the thermal stress analyses, the load distribution schematics, the archive is thin. What exists are beautiful drawings. What is largely absent is the math behind them. Now cross the Atlantic. The Hungarian Parliament building in Budapest. Construction began in 1885, completed in 1904, designed by Imre Steindl. By almost any measure, it is one of the most technically complex buildings of the 19th century. It has 691 rooms, 29 staircases, and a central dome that rises 96 meters, chosen specifically to match the height of St. Stephen's Basilica across the city, because Hungarian law at the time required both structures to be equal in height as a symbol of the balance between church and state. Steindl was a professor of architecture. He won the design competition in 1882. 3 years later, construction started. By 1902, Steindl had gone almost completely blind. He could not see the building he was designing. By 1904, when the Parliament was officially completed, Steindl had been dead for 2 years. The building was completed without its architect. Now go south. The Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest, Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu commissioned it in 1984. The official architect of record is Anca Petrescu, who was 28 years old when she was selected. She had no prior experience designing a building of this scale. The Palace of the Parliament is the second largest administrative building in the world by floor area, behind only the Pentagon. It has 1,100 rooms, 12 stories above ground, 8 stories below. It required the demolition of a significant portion of historic Bucharest, the relocation of tens of thousands of residents, and the labour of roughly 20,000 workers and 700 architects working in shifts around the clock. Anca Petrescu has spoken about the project in interviews over the decades. What she describes is not creative control. What she describes is a situation where Ceausescu himself would review plans and order revisions, sometimes tearing up entire sections, sometimes demanding structural changes that her team was then required to execute. The building that exists is, by her own account, not the building she designed. It is a building that emerged from a process where the named architect was functionally a draftsperson for someone else's vision. Who had that vision? Where did it come from? The dome sits at the centre, the same proportions, the same relationship to the columned facade below. Now go further east. The Vidhana Soudha in Bangalore, India, completed in 1956. Chief Minister S. Nijalingappa commissioned it, and the project is associated with his predecessor, Kengal Hanumanthaya, who reportedly sketched the original concept himself on paper and handed it to government engineers to execute. No licensed architect of record. The building seats the Karnataka state legislature. Its dome rises from a Neo-Dravidian design that fuses South Indian temple architecture with, look carefully, the same basic proportional logic as every other legislature on this list. Go to Havana, the Cuban capital, El Capitolio, completed in 1929 under President Gerardo Machado. The architects of record are Raul Otero and Eugenio Raineri Piedra. It was deliberately modelled on the United States Capitol. Its dome reaches 91.17 metres, which at the time of completion made it the third tallest dome in the world. The Cuban government at the time openly stated the building was a tribute to classical democratic architecture. What they did not explain was how a country with a fraction of the industrial capacity of the United States built in 4 years a dome that rivals the structural sophistication of one that took America 7. Go to Sri Lanka. The old Parliament building in Colombo, now called Presidential Secretariat. Go to Argentina. The Congress of the Argentine nation in Buenos Aires. Go to Australia. Parliament House in Melbourne, which was the federal capital before Canberra. Each one, the dome, the columns, the stairs, the portico, each one an architect of record whose documentation does not fully account for the precision of what was built. Here is the question that revisionist economic historians have started asking quietly in the last 2 decades. Not whether these buildings are beautiful or impressive. They clearly are. The question is about the transfer of knowledge. 19th century architectural education was not standardized globally. The École des Beaux-Arts, How in Paris, was the most influential design school in the world, and its graduates carried a visual vocabulary that shaped public buildings on every continent. That is the conventional explanation for why legislative buildings look alike. Shared aesthetic education, shared vocabulary. But the École des Beaux-Arts trained designers. It did not train structural engineers in the industrial sense. The thermal calculations for a cast iron dome, the load distribution for a stone drum supporting millions of pounds of metal, the waterproofing systems built into 19th century masonry. At this scale, these were not part of a standardized curriculum. They were proprietary knowledge, held by specific builders, passed through specific lineages. And when you go looking for those lineages, in the official records of the world's great capitals, the lineages disappear. What you find instead is a pattern that economic historians call institutional knowledge laundering. It is the process by which specialized technical knowledge is transferred without attribution, often because the attribution would be politically inconvenient or economically threatening. The group that holds the knowledge does not want competition. The government receiving the knowledge does not want to admit dependence. So the official record is sanitized. A local architect is named. The knowledge transfer is buried. The building gets built. This happened visibly in other industries in the same era. Standard Oil transferred refinery chemistry to international partners through front companies and unnamed consultants. The railroad industry moved surveying and tunnelling expertise across continents through engineering firms that deliberately obscured their parent organizations. The pattern in architecture follows the same logic. Now consider the economic implications. A government that builds an impressive Capitol dome is communicating something specific to foreign investors, to creditors, and to rival states. It is saying, we have the institutional sophistication to manage complex projects. We have the organizational capacity to marshal resources. We are a stable and capable sovereign entity. In the language of 19th and early 20th century geopolitics, a Capitol building was a credit instrument. It signaled creditworthiness. Nations that could build them could borrow against them. The European banking houses of the 19th century understood this explicitly. The Rothschild network, the Baring brothers, the Deutsche Bank, all of them used the physical landscape of capital cities as part of their sovereign credit assessments. A government that had recently completed a major public building was a government demonstrating fiscal and organizational capacity. A dome was, in a very literal sense, a financial asset. This reframes the question of why these buildings look alike. It is not only shared aesthetic vocabulary, it may also be shared branding. If the same network of knowledge holders is providing the technical expertise that makes these buildings possible, and if that network is also connected to the financial institutions that subsequently lend to these governments, then the dome is not just a symbol of democracy or national aspiration. It is a logo. It is the mark of a specific financial and technical ecosystem that is using architecture to identify its clients to other members of the network. Think about that for a moment. A 19th century European banker looking at a map of global lending opportunities would look at capital cities. A city with a completed dome in the classical style was a city that had already been vetted by the network. The building itself was the due diligence signal. This is not a conspiracy. It is an economic incentive structure. When information is expensive and travel is slow, you need external signals to identify trustworthy counterparties. The shared architectural vocabulary of legislative buildings was one of those signals. The knowledge transfer that made the buildings possible was the service being sold. The anonymous architects were the product. Which brings us back to the missing documentation. In 2009, a team of architectural historians at the University of Edinburgh began cataloguing the working drawings of 19th century parliamentary buildings across 4 continents. Their goal was to create a comparative archive of construction methods. What they found instead was a consistent gap. For 17 of the 19 buildings, the original structural calculations, meaning the actual load and stress mathematics, not the aesthetic drawings, were either absent from the official archive, held in private collections with restricted access, or recorded in shorthand systems that have not been fully decoded. The Edinburgh team published their preliminary findings in a 2012 paper titled "The Missing Mathematics of Parliamentary Architecture." It received almost no mainstream coverage. It was cited in subsequent academic work on 19th century knowledge transfer. It has not been incorporated into any general history of these buildings. The paper does not claim anything dramatic. It notes the gap. It asks why the gap exists. It suggests that further research into private engineering archives, specifically the records of firms connected to the major European banking houses of the period, might resolve the question. That research has not been funded. Now here is the detail that pulls everything together. The cast iron for the United States Capitol dome was supplied by a foundry called Janes, Fowler, Kirtland and Company, based in New York. The firm had previously supplied ironwork for the Crystal Palace exhibition structure in London in 1851. The Crystal Palace was the first major prefabricated cast iron structure in history. Its chief engineer was a man named Charles Fox. Fox's firm, Fox Henderson and Company, held the proprietary construction system that made the Crystal Palace possible. After the Crystal Palace project, Fox Henderson was dissolved. Its partners dispersed, their techniques dispersed with them, into firms that subsequently appear, often briefly and without detailed documentation, in the construction records of major public buildings across Europe and North America throughout the second half of the 19th century. One of the firms that absorbed former Fox Henderson personnel was connected, through 2 intermediary partnerships, to the same New York iron supply chain that produced the material for the Capitol dome. This is not proof of anything. It is a thread, but it is a thread that has not been pulled by official architectural history, because official architectural history is organized around named architects and national narratives, not around the movement of anonymous technical knowledge through commercial networks. The dome is on every capital because the dome was the product of a specific technical and financial ecosystem that operated globally in the 19th and early 20th centuries. That ecosystem preferred anonymity. It transferred knowledge through intermediaries. It left beautiful buildings and thin paper trails. The architects of record were sometimes talented designers who genuinely contributed to these projects. Sometimes they were administrators who managed the process of executing someone else's engineering. Sometimes they were names on documents who had little to do with what got built. The buildings remain. The calculations that made them structurally possible are largely gone. The men and institutions that likely produced those calculations were careful, over a long period of time, not to be found. The dome shows up on every capital because someone built a system for selling it, not just designing it. The architects whose names are on the records were often not the ones who solved the hard engineering problems. The people who did solve them stayed invisible by choice. That invisibility was the product. Understanding who profits from being uncredited is how you start reading economic history honestly. Subscribe for more.